Hey guys, and welcome back to the Renaissance Room podcast. It's Sunday. I just had biscuits. I don't know what it is, but I just feel like Sundays are the perfect day for biscuits. Like I feel like biscuits need to be in the oven, on the stove, Sunday morning. Always. And like a little bit of green tea. Fresh water, lemon. Like that's the breakfast duo. And like, of course you can have your potatoes, get the smothered potatoes going in there, get the sausage that curved back. Y'all know that sausage that curved back, like when you put it in the skillet and it's done, it's got that curve in the back. Do the sausage that curves back. Matter of fact, do two types of sausage. Do the patties. Do the patties. Okay. We like variety. Do the maple, hot, spicy patties. Okay. Scramble eggs. We can do without the eggs though. For me, I really only like eggs in a certain type of, I like eggs with veggies, and I like eggs in a burrito, and I like eggs, bless you, babe. I like eggs like on a sandwich or something, but I can't just eat like a side of eggs. You know what I mean? Like I just haven't done that in so long and I don't really find it appetizing. But anyway, good morning. This goes out in the morning. So good morning to you wherever you are. I was just, using Audible and, I'm like loving it. But I was just thinking about how cool it is to just listen to books and the joy of being able to have a commute. I'm honestly something that we took for granted. I'm going to be talking a little bit about like third spaces today. But I think about how, we used to drive to work, or, you used to maybe take the train depending on where you are, if you're like in a city or something. And how I used to be able to really use that time to like listen to podcasts and like explore my mind. Like, you know what I mean? Like get myself ready for the day, indulge in something that is intellectually stimulating and something that is kind of like mine. And I feel like we don't have that anymore. It's like we're working from home. You get your lunch break. That's 30 minutes. You're eating lunch. If you're lucky, you may get an hour. You may go for a little walk around the city. Walk around your home or wherever you live or whatever. Or you may clean up, right? Or you may have kids you tend to. But like, we no longer have that, like the joy in the commute, like there was really something in it. There was something in having that 30-minute commute to work that allowed you to just like kind of be in your own little orbit. And I just feel like that was really cool. And I think we lost that. But today I'm going to be talking about grievances as a Black woman, Black femininity, and having a third space for Black women in academia. Now, something that I think we all know and we talk about and we tell Black women, don't go get that PhD. You don't need another degree after a breakup. Black women, you can rest. You can stay out of academia. But what I want to acknowledge, because I think this is something that does not get talked about enough, is the loneliness that so many intellectually astute Black women feel. Right? Black women who have achieved great, success and have acquired numerous degrees and so forth in academia, oftentimes find themselves along this path because it is incredibly lonely. It's incredibly isolating. I question my own biases with femininity, right? And if I'm being honest, can I just have a human moment? I think that as so many Black people, what we do, especially those who kind of peer into our culture and look for solutions, right? We peer into our culture and we say, well, if we could just be more like this, right? If Black people would just do less of this and we would be more like that, if we could take a little bit of it off over here, add a little bit over there, then our perceptions and the perceptions that that others glean of us, right? Like others' perceptions of us within the world would change, right? We can shift their perspectives and we could just be more like this, right? Whatever this is, right? Oftentimes it's deeply personal, rooted in our own personal values and our own personal biases, but oftentimes that is a solution, right? So that's why I think when we start talking about the dysfunction and the chaos and all the things within the Black community, I don't really think that there are any, I think unfortunately you are amongst a culture of persons who have underwent quite a bit of genocide, you know what I mean? From environmental to psychological to physical, you know what I mean? And I don't really know what you do with the remains of that. I think you try to make something beautiful out of it. And I think this is why we go so hard for the aesthetics. This is why we really up the awareness, right? And we take pride in the creativity that is oftentimes born out of such deplorable conditions, the creativity that is born out of such deprivation, because I mean, quite literally, you're like living in a world that is like stacked against you, and so we find peace with that. But I think that there really is some grief for Black women in the space of intellectualism. And I also want to say this, too, because I think it's no different than men, right? And I seen that very early on as a young Black girl growing up, in middle class, kind of like looking at Black boys who, maybe had two parents and, were sound, right? Well, they were sound. There was stability in their lives. They were focused on good grades. They were doing well at what they do. I think it was very evident then that they were also experiencing a lot of loneliness, right? So that's one of the grievances about the Black experience, is that it is something that is so narrow, right? And so, for example, when we start talking about Black femininity and kind of seeing this cultural shift where Black women were kind of starting to identify with white versions of femininity. And I don't think that this was due to, this was not a space where, right, that third space where Black women of academia were coming together, Black women who really did grow up in middle class environments were coming together and say, hey, listen, we can define femininity for ourselves, right? Perhaps, yes, we have been in this space and we've been socialized, but we've also been in a space, right? We've also lived lives where we have been provided for, and we do have our own version of femininity that is absolutely adjacent, right? That is adjacent from what would be standard femininity for Black women, right? So this is ours, right? This is not us cosplaying into whiteness or white femininity, but this is our space, right? And I felt like that was not what we seen within the recent cultural trends, right? It wasn't Black women reclaiming and saying, hey, listen, Black women can show up in this space as well. Black women and Black people who have middle class have, similar values to that, or similar presentations to that of white America, but we are not seeking to, follow behind white Americans, right? We're not seeking to emulate. We're not seeking to, but what we're doing is we're showing up because we are every bit of American as the white Americans right next to us, right? And we've been in these rooms. We've lived these experiences. We've lived these lives. This is authentic to us, right? That's not what we saw, right? What we saw was, back to what I was saying, is, a very commonality that we do, and that we turn towards as Black people when we start to feel as though, white America is progressing, we're regressing, or whatever the case may be, right? Whether that's beauty, whether that's interracial relationships. I'm not really sure what really sparked a lot of Black women to kind of start gravitating towards this, or start cosplaying into like white femininity. I'm not really sure what that was. I think it was due to a multitude of factors. But I'm saying that it wasn't authentic, right? It wasn't authentic. It was really based on, hey, listen, if Black women would just shut up, straighten up, get like the white women, then Black women would have husbands. They would have, you know what I mean? It was more so of that. It was more so some of that. And so we saw that. And so what I'm thinking about when I say a third space is I'm thinking about the space for Black women who really did grow up middle class, right? Who did not necessarily come from poverty, but inevitably know struggles of Black life, right? You know what I mean? I think as much as we want to kind of, because we do this, right? Let's acknowledge this. And this is really what I'm doing. Like, I'm honestly acknowledging the grief, the emotional grief and the loneliness that comes from Black Americans who grew up middle class and who are in the field of academia, right? And I don't know why, it's really unfortunate that this is so dichotomous, right, within our community. Obviously, we know privilege plays a huge role, right? When I say privilege, we're talking about access, right? But it's really saddening because that's just the American way, right? Like the American way is it's menial labor, entrepreneurship, or it's through the American institutions. It's through academia. So there's really not a lot of different paths a person can take. You know what I mean? And if you say, hey, I don't want this small mom and pop shop or whatever the case may be, that's the ladder. Like the ladder is academia, so it's funny because we sit here and we critique, Black women in academia, and we critique, but it's like the reality is that, hey, listen, that's just the American way. You know what I mean? That's the American way, and do I think that Black women's degrees are a cover up for the emotional abandonment that I think a lot of us feel, not just from our communities, but even in like relationships, I would say yes. Because you have to understand, the more educated you are, typically the more isolated you become from those around you. Bell Hooks talked about this as I'm currently reading Rock My Soul. And I'm so excited because, what really piqued my interest in this was the self-esteem within Black people. I started to just notice we just are, as a people collectively, like the self-esteem is in the gutter. You know what I mean? And I think that this is also why for so many of us, we stay in cycles of poverty. We stay in cycles of poverty because of our inability to believe that we can change our situations and that we can, I don't want to use the word assimilate, but for a lack of better terms, assimilate into modern society, right? We don't feel as though we have the tools or the resources to kind of like enter modern society and become productive and like successful citizens, I guess you could say. You can meet people today who have opportunities to go to school, right? I know a lot of people talk about college and its expenses, but I don't know if you know this or not, but like if you're low income, you can get a Pell Grant and you can get up to $7,000, right, per semester. So depending on where you go to school, most full term tuitions for the semester is about $5,000. So you actually can go to school for free, right? You can start at a smaller college. You can start and so when I think about the lack of knowledge around how to really pay for college and the resources that are available for those that are low income, this brings me back to, right, the crux of it all, which is really low self-esteem, right? And I love how Bell Hooks talked about this. She said back in the 70s, with her mother growing up, for Black people, getting an education was your way into the world for your own personal freedom, right? It was your ability to make choice. It was your ability to build on your self-esteem, to enhance your life, essentially, to better your life. And she said that's how they just saw it back in the 70s, how all Black people saw it, but she did say that once schools became integrated, I think that was back in the 60s, 50s, she said that, the self-esteem of Black Americans Black children, it did start to plummet. She said that, the gifted programs in the white schools did not have any Black boys. She said that, just of course you have racist teachers and things like that. So, as the only Black kid or the few Black kids, that was like a bit of a culture shock. And it was very hard for a lot of them. And I think that was, that was intentional in the sense that that became psychologically crippling, for a lot of black children. And I think that's kind of where we are today. Fast forward. That's why we talk about Black teachers and all these different things, because it plays a huge role, but it's not just in the field of teaching. I think just seeing Black persons out in society who are doing great things. I mean, running into Black professionals in the grocery store or in your local whatever, I think that does play a huge role on what you feel as though you're capable of and what's possible for you. For example, just recently I was at a clothing store. I met a Black woman who was just very sure of herself, very successful, and just her warmth and her acknowledgement, us having the few words that we did exchange, gave me courage to go on and pursue what I'm going to pursue and do the things that I want to do. And honestly, I think that is the biggest revolution, right? That's why I tell you guys all the time, that's advocacy to me, right? Advocacy is showing up and being in certain rooms and environments and then just your presence. I think that's the new advocacy. I don't think that we necessarily have to go out and protest to, fight against certain things. I think it's a matter of getting in position and mobilizing ourselves, and then showing up for those who are in our community and those who are around us, because that's where the inspiration lies. You know what I mean? It's really saying, hey, listen, if I did it, you can do it. You know what I mean? And when we have these attitudes and we are, educated and aware of the communal grievances, we can carry that with a lot more compassion, right? We can acknowledge, the Black girl, you know what I mean, in the clothing store, and we can do it with so much grace, and we can do it with so much just, honesty that says, hey, I see you, right? So I'm losing, we're kind of all over the place. So let me dial it back. So to be a Black woman and not be this loud, bodacious, very hypersexual being, right? And I want to say this too, because something that I will address, okay, is my own bias, right? For me, my version of femininity is different, right? And what's unfortunate for a lot of Black women who are in this space of like academia and so forth, who maybe grew up middle class, is that, instead of your version of femininity being like, hey, this is what it is for me, it may be classy, it may be elegant, it may be poised, it may be grace, it's like, oh, you're acting white. You're being white, you're acting white. And it's like for the black women who are on the other opposite side of that, they oftentimes feel pigeonholed. You know what I mean? They feel so pigeonholed. And it's like, that's why you kind of see, the continuous contortion of their bodies. You know what I mean? Because it's like, well, this is a little too black, but I want this to be black. You know what I mean? I want the hypersexuality, but I want to tone down certain facial features. I want, you know what I mean? You have this continuous contortion, I think, for black women, because it's like, you want to be black enough to get the black guys. Yeah. You want to be black enough to get the black guys, right? But at the same time, it's like you don't want to downplay the fact that you are intelligent. You don't want to downplay the fact that, no, you maybe don't come from the gutter. You don't have this type of you know what I mean? And I think that is something that so many black Americans feel because there is no third space, right? We know that once we get into middle class, or if we're coming from middle class, we know that, okay, listen, white people... I think the world is different. Let me just say that. I do think that white Americans are seeking a little bit more progress. I think as a collective, right, you see this with the younger generations. They're really integrated and they're kind of building relationships and so forth amongst one another. We didn't really have that. I will say, grew up middle class. The white kids were over there. The black kids were over there, So it wasn't, quite what it is today. But to me, I feel like that's progress, right? That's racial progress. And so, I lost my train of thought. But essentially what I'm saying is that for so many of us, for the intellects and for the academics, you feel isolated, romantically. You feel isolated romantically. You oftentimes, I wouldn't say you feel isolated communally, because I do think you can kind of link up with other black women. But I think when you start talking about just the quite naturally the desires of all women, to be partnered and things like that, overwhelmingly, so many academics feel overlooked. You're completely overlooked because you're not loud enough. You're not bodacious enough. Perhaps you're not curvy enough. And I think that this is a safe space, and I think we should acknowledge that. It's not a matter of it being a lack of fashion or a lack of personality. No, it's just a simple fact that, for so many of us, you're overlooked if you're a black woman and you don't fit into these stereotypes of hypersexuality, right? If you're not flashy, if you're not loud, then women aren't checking for you. Then men aren't checking for you. You know what I mean? They're not checking for you. And it's the same thing. You hear a lot of black guys who are also, in the space of academia, who may be professionals, who may, you know what I mean? You hear the same thing. You know what I mean? It's like, listen, if you're a black guy and you're, hey, let's say they'll call you prim and proper, then they're like, hey, listen, this guy is a square. And so I think we kind of have these conversations, but we don't really talk about the grievance that comes with, you know what I mean? And I don't think that there's a sense of jealousy, right, or opposition to those who may fit into a more socially accepted stereotype of blackness, right? Socially accepted expectation of blackness. But I do think that, for so many people, it's like you're on the outside looking inside of this club that you can't get in, while the whole time your skin permits you to be in this club. You know what I mean? Like your skin permits you to be in this club, but it's like you can't get in the club because you're not fitting, the certain type of aesthetic, and that is something that is a deep grievance, and you kind of see this too when you don't, the aesthetic. Don't sit here and act slow. You know what I mean? I ain't gonna say slow. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be crass, but y'all know the aesthetic. It's the thing that, you have the young white TikTokers and things like that come into when they start to take on a identity of blackness, and they kind of want to dibble and dabble in black culture. It's that aesthetic. Yes, it's the loud, it's the I'm here, it's all of that. You know what I mean? And I think for those of us who are on the outside of that, you maybe say, hey, I have different values. I don't really present myself to be so loud, and I don't need to be so X, Y, and Z. You're 1,000% overlooked. And then what's unfortunate too, I would say, for black women is that, what happens is, like, okay, you're overlooked. You get with people who may also be within the same, environment as you, right? Another middle class black man. And it's like, they don't want to socialize with you. They want to get inside the club as well. Right. So it's like, they're looking for the women who are, you know what I mean? And so there's just a lot of grievance there. There is a lot of grievance there. And I think that this is also why you do have the coupling with like interracial relationships, not because of self-hate, not because of, stereotypes, not because of socialization, but for the simple fact that like there is no third space for Black academics. You know what I mean? Like there's no space for you, right? There's no space for you. And on average, I mean, it's not a one-to-one type of thing. It's like you're on an island by yourself. You know what I mean? It's like you're on an island by yourself, and that is incredibly isolating, and you think, okay, well, if you just get a makeover or whatever, it's like, yeah, sure, you can do that. Like, of course, you can make yourself more loud. You can be more flashy. You can you can do all these things. But the reality is that you're going to find yourself coupled with people who don't quite fit you intellectually. You know what I mean? And perhaps, you may settle for more of a physical love interest, and perhaps that could suffice, for the long term, pleasure. Perhaps that could suffice. But, at the end of the day, you never really feel like yourself. Right. And I think you can kind of see this play out in a lot of persons. Y'all know we ain't talking about celebrities, but you can see this play out in a lot of relational dynamics. You'll always kind of see the woman who kind of fits into this stereotype of the, hypersexuality, constantly trying to defend her intelligence, constantly trying to say, hey, listen, I am smart. Okay. I do have a brain. I am smart. Look at me, seeking validation for the fact that, hey, look, I am an intellectual. You know what I mean? And so I just think it's incredibly isolating for a lot of us. And I think, my heart just goes out to Black women who are showing up and who are authentic and who express themselves as such, but who are just simply overlooked, because they don't fit into the standard and the expectation that is Black femininity, and because there is no other space for, Black femininity to exist outside of this very I don't want to say ratchet in terms of like a derogatory. I'm not using it in a derogatory sense, but we're just saying like, y'all know what I'm saying. You know what I mean? If you're not that, then a lot of times it's complete opposite. It's complete opposite. So I think that there really is something in that, right? You have persons who are of a middle class, but they're not culturally averse. You know what I mean? There's some people who have no idea, so there really is no space for academics. I think for Black women, do I think it's a coping mechanism? I think it's just more so like hey, listen, finding life's purpose, moving on, monetary gain. I think it's all of those things. I don't think that it's so much of like, I'm trying to numb something. I think it's just more so like, hey, I'm doing the best that I have with the resources that I have. And this is just what makes sense for the next thing, right? I'm starting goals. I'm doing different things. And I think that, there's joy in learning. Okay. You can't knock the hustle. You know what I mean? There's joy in learning. And so I think that's really what it becomes because, anything outside of that, your world gets, I don't want to say it gets smaller, because I think it can actually expand your world depending on who you are as a person, depending on your personality and the level of depth that you have within yourself. And do you know yourself, But I do think that, it does kind of get smaller, because you do find yourself more isolated from your peers. And even if you don't want to be, you can't fit all the way in over here, but you're constantly looking inside this club that because of the color of your skin, you're permitted to get in, but you don't fit in this club, and so that's what's incredibly disheartening about it, and it's also disheartening when you see, beautiful women who may naturally just have those curves or whatever, finding themselves coupled with men who, do not edify them at all, but that's typically the trade-off. That's the trade-off for Black femininity, so there is no third space. There is no, and when I say third space, I'm talking about like, okay, you have your work, you have this, but here's a space where it's like, I'm seen. I don't know if I'm using third space correctly. I think third space is more so like, it's your home, no, I'm definitely using it correctly. Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like there is no third space for Black academics, not male or female. I think you eventually just kind of develop as a person and you start to build your own confidence and your own self-assuredness. But I think that doesn't come without a lot of education. that comes with, a lot of acquiring of education and resources and understanding about self and therapy and all these different things that, of course, is going to make you a little bit more rare and a little bit more incompatible with those who are not in that space of work, in that line of work, right? Working on self. But yeah, so I think at the end of the day, academia doesn't become a crutch or a means to coddle oneself from loneliness. But I just think it kind of becomes the journey to like personal development for so many of us, because you just kind of, you grow older, you realize that like, hey, listen, a lot of this stuff is performative. I'm Black, but I don't fit into this. I'm not that, you know what I mean? I am sexy, but maybe in my own way, right? I don't have a desire to be so flamboyant. And oftentimes there was an expectation for you to be, and I think in part that's just American values, right? We value narcissism. We value things like that. So I'm going to end there. But I just wanted to get on here and acknowledge all of the Black intellectuals who feel the same way, who feel like, man, there really is no space, especially when you start talking about romantic interests and you start talking about, I would say friendships too sometimes, but yeah, it's a huge thing. So I just want to let you know that you are seen, and y'all peace out and have a good day.